All right, so this is part two of the week one lecture. And yeah, let's dive right into it. So I'm going to talk about the Spanish in North America. Yeah, the Spanish in North America. So of course, Spanish settlement and really all European settlement in the Americas began with Columbus in 1492. Columbus famously was trying to reach India, but instead landed in the Caribbean and what is now the Bahamas. This facilitated a 16th century, this in turn facilitated a 16th century Spanish Empire centered in modern day Mexico, the Caribbean, and South America as well, that focused primarily on gold and silver mining. And of course, this also facilitated, this was sort of the beginning of disease thoroughly decimating Native American populations. But I should mention that even though disease was the biggest factor, most often, so again, the Spanish were interested in, among other things, mining for gold and silver to enrich, sort of the conquistadors and the monarchs who funded them, the Spanish monarchy that funded them. And they employed, or actually employed is the wrong word, they basically enslaved indigenous peoples who labored in terrible conditions and in these mines. And that was, most scholars think, a factor in why the Native American population was decimated. But again, the main factor, the main factor is undoubtedly disease in this case and in many other cases in the Americas. Okay, so Spain extended its reach in the Americas after reaping the benefits of its colonies in Mexico, the Caribbean, and South America. Expeditions slowly began combing the continent and bringing Europeans into the modern day United States in the hopes of establishing religious and economic dominance in a new territory, in this case, North America. So the first European to arrive in North America technically was Juan Ponce de Leon. So this has nothing to do with the English in Jamestown, which I'll get to in a second. So Juan Ponce de Leon arrived in the area named La Florida, what's now Florida, in 1513. He found, when he arrived in Florida, he found between 150,000 and 300,000 Native Americans there. And European explorers, meanwhile, these European explorers, in this case Spanish explorers, had high hopes for wealth in Florida, extracting natural resources in Florida, but the reality never really matched aligned with their expectations and imaginations. Okay, let's talk about the French in Florida. Sorry, the French in North America, I should say. And this is if you look on the left side of your screen, this is a depiction of New Orleans in 1726, when it was an 8-year-old French frontier settlement. Okay, so the French crown subsidized exploration in the early 16th century. Early French explorers sought a fabled Northwest Passage, referring to a mythical waterway passing through the North American continent to Asia. Despite the wealth of the New World, Asia's riches still beckoned to Europeans. And so Canada's St. Lawrence River appeared to be, perhaps it looked to many Europeans, it looked to many of the French like to resemble, something like a Northwest Passage. And actually, let me talk about that for a second. So yeah, this was, there was a lot of focus on this mythical Northwest Passage, right? And the idea was you could sort of cut through basically a waterway through North America that would lead you to the Far East, right? Lead you to places like China and India. And of course, that doesn't exist, but the St. Lawrence River appeared to be, maybe, possibly a Northwest Passage, right? So the French weren't necessarily looking to settle and colonize in, North America specifically. They kind of saw it in many cases as a means to an end, a means of getting to the Far East and accessing trade and the riches of the Far East. But they instead ended up staying in parts of North America and having certainly a big impact. Okay, so yeah, so Canada's St. Lawrence River appeared to be, kind of look like a Northwest Passage, possibly. It stretched deep into the continent and into the Great Lakes. And French colonial possessions ended up centering on these bodies of water, referring to the St. Lawrence River. And later on, the French set up along the Mississippi River all the way down to the port of New Orleans, which you can see depicted on the left side of your screen. So French colonization developed through investment from private trading companies. So traders established Port Royal in Acadia, what's known as now as Nova Scotia, in 1603, and launched trading expeditions that stretched down the Atlantic coast as far as Cape Cod. So the needs of the fur trade set the future pattern of French colonization. When you think of French colonization, you want to think of the fur trade, right? It was centered around, really, in many ways, the fur trade. Founded in 1608 under the leadership of Samuel de Champlain, there we go. Quebec provided the foothold for what would become New France. French fur traders placed a higher value on cooperating with indigenous people than on establishing a successful French colonial footprint. Asserting dominance in the region could have been to their own detriment, actually. As it might have compromised their access to skilled Native American trappers and therefore eventually to wealth. So yeah, that's one important, let me kind of highlight this. That's one important difference between French settlement and English settlement, and even to a large extent Spanish settlement as well. So the French typically had much better relations with Native Americans. Now, there's not to say that there weren't instances of incursion into Native American land by French settlers, by French colonization, and that there weren't instances of violence and other atrocities. There certainly were, but the French in general sort of embedded themselves in Native communities. In fact, many of them, many French, and actually most of the to the extent there were French settlers, most of them were men. And these men, many of these men married indigenous women in North America and gave birth to mixed race, what are known as Métis or Métis children. And the family was sort of incorporated into this hybrid European, half European, half Native American, uniquely, in many cases, American society. So yeah, few Frenchmen traveled to the New World to settle permanently. And yeah, the people that did travel were typically men. In fact, few traveled at all. Many persecuted French Protestants, known as Huguenots, sought to immigrate after France criminalized Protestantism in 1685. But actually, all non-Catholics were technically forbidden in New France around the same time as well. So the French preference for trade over permanent settlement fostered, as I mentioned a second ago, more cooperative and mutually beneficial relationships with Native Americans. That was typical. Was typical among the Spanish and English. Perhaps eager to debunk the anti-Catholic elements of the Black legend, the French worked to cultivate cooperation with Native Americans. For example, Jesuit missionaries adopted different conversion strategies than the Spanish Franciscans. Spanish missionaries typically brought natives into enclosed missions, whereas Jesuits more often lived with or alongside indigenous people. Many fur traders also, as I mentioned a second ago, married indigenous women and gave spawned offspring of mixed race or Métis, half European, half indigenous children. Okay, and this brings us to the first permanent English settlements in North America. So in April 1607, Englishmen aboard three ships named the Susan, Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery sailed 40 miles up the James River, by the way, named for the English king, in present-day Virginia, which, by the way, was named for Elizabeth I, known as the Virgin Queen, and settled on such a place. The uninhabited peninsula they selected was upriver and out of sight of Spanish patrols, and that's why it seemed like an attractive, or one of the reasons why it seemed like an attractive place to settle. it offered easy defense against ground assaults and was both uninhabited and located close to many Native American villages and their potentially lucrative trading networks, right? But you know, there's a reason why it was uninhabited. They soon figured out. The Native Americans had wisely chosen to leave it largely uninhabited, and there were very good reasons for this, right? That the settlers of what became known as Jamestown very soon figured out, right? So the location was disastrous in many ways. So first of all, indigenous people had ignored the peninsula for two reasons. First of all, it had terrible soil that hampered agriculture. Secondly, it possessed brackish tidal water that led to debilitating disease. So it was sort of a breeding ground for diseases like yellow fever and malaria. And so that's not a good place to settle, right? Despite these setbacks, the English built Jamestown, what became known as Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in the New World, beginning in 1607, in what eventually became the United States. Okay, so the English had not entered a wilderness, of course, but had arrived amid a people they called the Powhatan Confederacy. And of course, the Powhatan Confederacy were headed by the chief Powhatan, as the Europeans at least referred to him, who led nearly 10,000 Algonquin-speaking people in the Chesapeake region. They burned vast acreage to clear brush and create sprawling artificial park-like grasslands so they could easily hunt deer, elk, and bison. The Powhatan also raised corns, beans, and squash, again, the Three Sisters, possibly also sunflowers, and rotated acreage throughout the Chesapeake. Without plows, manure, or draft animals, like the Europeans were accustomed to using with their agriculture, the Powhatan produced a remarkable number of calories cheaply and efficiently. Jamestown was fundamentally established to basically under the motivations of profit, right? So it was a profit-seeking venture at its core, backed by investors who wanted obviously a monetary return on their investment, right? The colonists were mostly gentlemen and proved entirely unprepared for the challenges ahead in the New World. They hoped for easy riches, but found none. As John Smith later complained, they, quote, would rather starve than work, end quote. They would rather starve than work. And so they did. So things were terrible the first few years in Jamestown, especially the first winter. Disease and starvation ravaged the colonies, thanks in part to the peninsula's unhealthy location and the fact that supplies from England arrived sporadically or spoiled. Fewer than half of the original colonists survived even the first 9 months. Let me repeat that. So almost, or actually less than half of the people that arrived in Jamestown in 1607 actually survived the first 9 months, not even the first year. John Smith, a yeoman's son and capable leader, quickly took command of the crippled colony and promised, quote, he that will not work shall not eat, end quote. He also navigated Native American diplomacy, and this was key to keeping Jamestown afloat, if you can even call it that. So Powhatan kept the English alive that first winter. So scholars think that Jamestown would not have survived. Essentially, no one would have survived, and no Europeans would have survived in Jamestown if not for the help of local Native Americans associated with Powhatan and Powhatan's, sort of confederacy. The Powhatan had in fact welcomed the English and placed a high value in metal axe heads, kettles, tools, and guns, and eagerly traded furs and other abundant goods for them. With 10,000 confederated natives and with food in abundance, indigenous people had little to fear, but also much to gain from the isolated outpost of sick and dying Englishmen. So, you might think, upon first glance, you might, the assumption might be that, the smarter way to go would have been for Powhatan and his confederacy, the local indigenous peoples, to just kind of let the Europeans starve. So but that's from the vantage point That's from our vantage point. We know how things turned out. We know that this facilitated, along with other settlements, the spread of debilitating disease, and eventually, essentially, the takeover, European and eventually American takeover of most of North America, and in fact, the European takeover of the Americas more generally. But again, hindsight is 2020. And they didn't know that. From there, it's important to understand from their perspective, they didn't seem threatened by this new colony. They saw a bunch of sick and dying Englishmen, and they thought, well, if they're going to stick around here for a few years, we may as well take advantage of it and trade with them. They do have some things, despite the fact that they have no idea how to survive here. And their attempts at agriculture and food cultivation and just managing their society in a basic sense are laughable, right? But they have things to offer us. They have axe heads and kettles and guns. We can trade furs with them, and and so for that reason, they kept them alive so they could trade with them. So it does actually make sense from that perspective if you think about it. Really, what changed everything, though, was tobacco in Jamestown. Tobacco changed everything in Jamestown. So in 1616, John Rolfe crossed tobacco strains from Trinidad and Guyana and planted Virginia's first tobacco crop. The first harvest occurred in 1617, and the colony, upon its first tobacco harvest, the colony sent its first cargo of tobacco back to England. This special New World tobacco fetched a high price in Europe, and the tobacco boom began in Virginia and then later spread to Maryland. Within 15 years, American colonists were exporting over 500,000 pounds of tobacco per year. Within 40 years, they were exporting about 15 million pounds of tobacco. So again, tobacco changed everything. Essentially, it saved Virginia from ruin. It incentivized further colonization, and it laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the United States. With the new market open, Virginia drew not only merchants and traders, but also settlers. Colonists came in droves. They were mostly young, mostly male, and mostly, at least initially, indentured servants who signed contracts called indentures that bonded them to employers for a period of years in return for passage across the ocean. But even the rough terms of servitude were no match for the promise of land and potential profits that beckoned English farmers. Okay, and let me get into English settlement in New England. Okay, this is the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Massachusetts Bay Colony official seal. So the English colonies in New England, established from 1820 onward, were founded with loftier goals than those in Virginia. Although migrants to New England expected economic profits, religious motives directed the rhetoric and much of the reality of these colonies. Not every English person who moved to New England during the 17th century was a very religiously minded Puritan. We'll talk about the Puritans in a second here. However, Puritans certainly dominated the politics, religion, and even the culture of New England in the first, roughly 80 years or so of English settlement in New England. In the 17th century. Even after 1700, the region's Puritan inheritance shaped many aspects of its history, of its development. So the term Puritan began actually as an insult, and its recipients usually referred to each other as the godly if they used any specific term at all. So they typically didn't refer to each other as Puritans. That was sort of a pejorative. That's what we've come to call them. Puritans believed that the Church of England did not distance itself far enough from Catholicism after King Henry VIII of England broke with Rome in the 1530s. They largely agreed with European Calvinists, followers of John Calvin, on matters of religious doctrine, and especially on the matter of predestination. Or the concept of predestination. So Calvinists and Puritans believed that humankind was redeemed by God's grace alone, and that the fate of an individual's immortal soul was predestined. The happy minority that God had already chosen to save were known among English Puritans as the elect. So this is known as the doctrine of predestination. So they believe that, it was preordained who was going to get into heaven and who was going to get into hell. And you would think, it's actually been a lot kind of philosophized and written and said about this, but upon first glance, upon first hearing about this, you might think that this would lead to a sort of nihilism, like, oh, it doesn't matter, it's already, whether I'm going to spend eternity in heaven or spend eternity in hell is already predestined. So why am I going to worry about it and sort of prove that I'm among the elect? But in fact, at least among the Puritans, this led to the opposite of nihilism. This led to people making undertaking huge efforts to prove that they're among the elect, to act in a way that demonstrated their virtue, their morality, their industriousness as well. And that's sort of tied to virtue and morality and Puritan, conceptions. And so anyway, that's the doctrine of predestination. This has been written about by theorists like Max Weber and how this influenced the development of capitalism, but I'm not going to talk any more about that right now. So yeah, Calvinists also argued that the decoration of churches, reliance on ornate ceremony, and a corrupt priesthood obscured God's message. They believed that the reading of the Bible was the best way to understand God. So Calvinists believed that, and Puritans believed that as well. So while the Puritans did not succeed in building a godly utopia in New England, of course, which was in a way their goal, a combination of Puritan traits with several external factors created colonies wildly different from any other region settled by English people. Unlike those heading to Virginia, colonists in New England, starting with the arrivals in Plymouth at Cape Cod in 1620, the Pilgrims, known as the Pilgrims, Massachusetts Bay colonists headed by John Winthrop, that's the Puritans, who started their colony at about 1630. Connecticut was founded in 1636, and Rhode Island as well was founded in 1636. All of these settlers generally arrived in family groups. Most New England immigrants were small landholders in England, a class contemporary English called the middling sort, the middling class, basically. So these were middling class families who arrived, as opposed to English gentlemen looking to make a quick buck. And those were the people who arrived in Virginia and settled Jamestown for the most part. When they arrived in New England, they tended to replicate their home environments, founding towns composed of independent landholders. The New England climate and soil made large-scale plantation agriculture impractical. So the system of large landholders using masses of enslaved laborers or indentured servants to grow labor-intensive crops, which became part and parcel with Southern agriculture, and as a result, Southern economy, society, and politics, right, which we'll talk a lot more about. That system was predicated on large plantations producing staple crops. That system was never tenable in New England. That didn't make sense. That didn't fit with the climate and the soil and the sort of topography and geography of New England, and therefore a society of small landholders, small farmers took hold in New England pretty quickly. Okay, so in conclusion, the fledgling settlements in Virginia and Massachusetts paled in importance when compared to the sugar colonies of the Caribbean, right? So the English also, it's important to remember, established colonies in places like Jamaica and Barbados. And really those colonies, at least initially, were more important. They were more remunerative, undoubtedly more remunerative. That's where the wealth was, at least initially. And that's where a lot of the focus of English colonization efforts were, right? So these North American British colonies, Virginia and Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and et cetera, were valued more as marginal investments and social safety valves where the poor of England could be released. However, these colonies nonetheless created a foothold for Britain on a vast North American continent. So they were important in that respect, right? And although the 17th century would be fraught for Britain, religious, social, and political upheavals would behead one king and force another to flee his throne, settlers in Massachusetts and Virginia were nonetheless tied together by the emerging Atlantic economy. While commodities such as tobacco and sugar fueled new markets in Europe, the economy grew increasingly dependent on slave labor, at least in the South. and even in the north to a certain extent, which was connected to the southern economy. Enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic world would further complicate the collision of cultures in the Americas. The creation and maintenance of a slave system would spark new understandings of human difference and new modes of social control. The economic exchanges, the Atlantic economy would not only generate wealth and exploitation, they would also lead to new cultural systems and new identities for inhabitants of at least 4 continents. And this kind of leads me into what I wanted to talk about next, which is slavery.